This morning, we are beginning a new series for the summer. One of the things that we try to do here at Faith Bible is take a break for the summer from what we've normally been doing. And we finished up the series on the book of James. And so timing-wise, worked out. And so as we take a break during the summer, we try to do something a little different that will last through the summer, realizing people come and go. And so what we identified this summer is a look at the biblical feasts of Israel. Something we hear about, talk about. We talk about Passover, we talk about Feast of Trumpets, Tabernacles, but what are they and what do they represent? What do they look forward to? And so over the course of the summer, we intend to take some time to look at these biblical feasts so we understand what they are and then what do they really mean. So here's the shameless plug. One of the resources that we are making available to the church is a book called The Feasts of the Lord, and one of the authors is our own Kevin Howard. Okay, so these are available in the office, well illustrated, and explains the history and as well as how those feasts may even be observed today. And so they're available in the office. We ordered a limited number. If that's of interest to you, feel free to stop in and pick one up. I think the cost is $20. So, but here's how we're going to start this morning. I want you to go to Colossians chapter 2. Colossians chapter 2. May seem like an odd place to begin, and as we look at the idea of the feasts of Israel, but you'll understand in a moment as we consider the words of the Apostle Paul. Now, I want to just pick up in rather an odd place. Colossians chapter 2, verse 11. Verse 13. When you were dead in your transgressions and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he made you alive together with him, having forgiven us all our transgressions, having canceled out the certificate of debt consisting of decrees against us, which was hostile to us, and he's taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. And when he had disarmed the rulers and authorities, he made a public display of them, having triumphed over them through him. Therefore, no one is to act as your judge in regard to food or drink, or in respect to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath day, things which are a mere shadow of what is to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. That shadow and substance then is the basis of the theme that we've adopted for the summer. Shadows and substance. When Paul wrote this to the Colossians, he was wrestling with some issues that the church in Colossae was wrestling with. Sometimes we think that we look back in time, we think these churches were perfect and everything was going well. No, these churches faced real problems in real time. And there were two major problems that the church at Colossae was facing. And one of them had to do with a school of thought that was early in its beginnings called Gnosticism that had some really strange ideas about who Jesus was. That Jesus wasn't really God. He couldn't be. He would be sinful if he was. And therefore, Paul has to bring some correction. Jesus is not a created being. Jesus is the fullness of the Godhead that dwells in him bodily. And so Paul writes to the Colossians and gives some correction there. The other is a problem that was not just true of Colossae, but true of a number of churches. Remembering the time in which Paul is writing this. Remember, Christianity was birthed in a Jewish context. It was based on the Jewish scriptures. It was a Jewish Messiah who had fulfilled them. And so the early believers were Jewish believers. Well, what began to infiltrate the churches was a thinking that, well, in order to be a true believer, you had to be Jewish, or you had to be fulfilling all the requirements of Judaism. And so Paul has to bring corrections to that. You see it in Galatians, you see it here in Colossians, we saw it in Romans, we see it throughout, because it was a major issue in the life of the early church. How can we be a ministry and a church of Gentiles and Jews, but yet we don't have to embrace everything out of Judaism? And that's really what Paul is speaking to here. He said, look, don't let anyone be your judge when it comes to observing certain days, foods, some food you eat, some food you can't eat, out of the dietary restrictions of the law. He says, don't let anybody judge you there. And he talks about days and he talks about festivals. And that's where we are in our study of the feasts of Israel. Because what Paul says is it's not the observance and keeping legalistically those things. It really is about Jesus. Because those things are mere shadows of what Jesus realizes, or what can be experienced in the person of Jesus. And so with that in mind, I want to go back to Leviticus chapter 23. Leviticus chapter 23. And Leviticus chapter 23 is a chapter in which all those feasts of Israel occur in this one chapter. The instructions regarding the feasts are all here. And certainly they're in other passages, but they're all together here in Leviticus chapter 23. We're not going to read the entire chapter. I just want to do the opening because in the opening verses, he talks about a day, days, Sabbath, and he talks about festivals, feasts. Okay? Leviticus chapter 23. The Lord spoke again to Moses, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, the Lord's appointed times, which you shall proclaim as holy convocations. My appointed times are these." Some translations may have the Lord's festivals or the Lord's seasons, but the best way to understand that is appointed times. For 6 days, work may be done, but on the seventh day there is a Sabbath of complete rest, a holy convocation. You shall not do any work. It's a Sabbath to the Lord in all your dwellings. And then he begins to enumerate the festivals. Beginning in verse 4, he talks about Passover and unleavened bread. Beginning in verse 9, first fruits. Verse 15, the Feast of Weeks or Pentecost. Verse 26, the Day of Atonement. And then in verse 33, the Feast of Booths. So in all, there are 7 feasts that are biblical feasts that are mentioned for the people of Israel. There's the Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, Pentecost, or sometimes you'll see the Feast of Weeks, trumpets, Day of Atonement, and tabernacles. Now, some of those are single days, Passover, Day of Atonement, but they're often then attached to a number of days, a week, for example. And so these are the feasts that we're going to be looking at over the course of the next weeks this summer. And then at the end of the summer, we're actually going to add 2 feasts that are not part of these feasts. We're going to just look at 2 others that you may be familiar with, but they're not in the same category, okay, as these. And so as we look and start looking and introducing this, there's some thoughts that we need to focus on for some clarification, okay? We need to have a calendar clarification. By that, I mean this. As you look at these idea of feasts and festivals, they're not unique to the people of Israel. Religions, no matter where you are in the world, these religions often have festivals associated with them. By the way, we use the term feast. Don't think a lot of times when I hear the word feast, like you know what I'm thinking of? Food, okay? Thanksgiving, feast, okay? Don't be thinking in those kinds of terms, okay? A feast, that's not what the feasts represent. They're larger festivals that the people would be gathered around and gathered to. So, religions often have festivals associated with their particular religion, ways to observe days or works, or for some, they're different gods. Okay? And think about Ramadan. Ramadan, if you have Muslim friends, they follow Ramadan. Ramadan is a Islamic Muslim feast, even though it lasts 30 days. Okay? Other religions have similar types of things. In the ancient world, a lot of these festivals or feasts were based on agriculture, the planting and harvesting of crops. They were seasons were agricultural seasons. And there are some who look at these feasts, and some of them would make sense, Feast of First Fruits or whatever, that's harvest, that's the idea of agriculture. So there are some who look at this passage and say, well, Israel's feasts are nothing more than agricultural feasts. And our answer is no, that's not the case. Number one, God says these are his appointed times. It's not merely based on the seasons. But there's something else that was, therefore, had to be significant and to give clarification to the calendar. The Hebrews, the Jewish folks, operated on a lunar calendar. A lunar calendar is 29 and a half days. Okay, think about our calendar. 30 days have September, April, June, and November. All the rest have 31, except February, which has 28. And on a leap year, you add one. Okay. Our calendar is not a lunar calendar. The Hebrew calendar was a lunar calendar, 29 and a half days. There are 12 months to that lunar calendar. And if you start to think about it, you realize there's a problem. Eventually, those agricultural seasons get confused. All of a sudden, you're having the feast of first fruits in the fall because the calendar doesn't stay consistent. It rotates. You see, the agricultural seasons are solar seasons, not lunar seasons. And eventually, the calendar will turn over, and you won't be able to be following the feasts in the order that they ought to be followed. That's why Ramadan changes all the time. So the Hebrews recognized they had a problem, and so this is what they did. They had a leap year, except their leap year was not 1 year. Leap year for them was 7 times in the space of 19 years. So every 19 years, the Hebrew calendar added a day. 7 years makes sense, right? We know the number 7, and we talk about Sabbaths here, significant. Every 19 years, there are 7 leap years. And they would add a day to the last month of the year called Adar. And so Adar would have 30 and a half days, okay? But that wouldn't correct it. And so every 7 years, you added a day, and then you added a whole month, okay? So 7 times in 19 years, you didn't have 12 months a year, you had 13 months. And that month was called Second Adar. So you had First Adar and Second Adar. But that way, the seasons and the festivals, could stay on track with regards to spring and fall. And the pattern that you see here is that there are 4 spring feasts and 3 fall feasts is the pattern. Okay? So that gives some clarification to their calendar. So Passover is always around March, April in our calendar. That's how they keep it in March, April, as opposed to all of a sudden having Passover in November. Okay. But then we need to give some clarification, what I'll call festal clarification. This idea of the feast. Some things to think about for clarification. Number one is the prominence of the Sabbath. The prominence of the Sabbath. We see it and we read it in the opening verses. You also see it. How many feasts are there? 7. How long do some of these feasts last? 7 days. You see this idea of 7 and the principles of the Sabbath now running throughout the Jewish calendar. Okay? What does the Sabbath represent? Well, it reflects rest. That's the most obvious. We know that from creation, Genesis 1, Genesis 2, God creates, and then on the 7th day, he rests. Now, what does that mean? It does not mean what you and I probably are going to do this afternoon. Okay? I know it's Father's Day. You know what Father's Day is all about? It gives fathers the privilege to grill out. We get to cook lunch. Okay. Listen, rest has nothing to do with taking a nap. God did not say, I've done 6 days of work, now I need a rest. That's not what it's about. The idea of rest is certainly completion, but it has the idea of perfection and now dwelling in his presence. Probably the idea in Genesis 1 and 2 is God creates a temple in creation. That's what creation seems to represent, is a cosmic temple. And God then rests, that is, God sets a dwelling and comes to be present amongst his creation. That's probably what rest means. His presence and rest, perfection, that God is now meeting and God is able to be present in his creation. And you see that now the principle is for the people of Israel, they 6 days, and then the 7th day was the Sabbath, was a day to remember God's rest. When God gave the commandment regarding the Sabbath, he said, look, because on 6 days the Lord God created the heavens and the earth and all that is in them, and that 7th day he rested, so you shall too. The idea is to step back and in some measure enjoy the opportunity to meet with God. God is present. In Genesis 1 and 2, that's probably what was happening with God now in his presence with Adam and Eve. Genesis chapter 3, something goes astray. There's the fall. And when God comes to meet with Adam, Genesis 3 says he comes walking in the cool of the day. They're hiding. They're hiding away from his presence. And God says, Adam, where are you? Things are not at rest. See? Adam, because of his rebellion, now is not. I cannot meet with God. And so God's answer to that, beginning in chapter 3 of Genesis, is redemption. The great promise. He says, look, number one, there's going to be a curse. You're not going to be able to experience rest, but there's a way of redemption. And he talks about that in verse 15. And what begins in Genesis chapter 3 is God's work of redemption, his plan of redemption. Now is giving directions to Moses for the people of Israel. And this is following the Ten Commandments. This is post-Ten Commandments. Verse 12, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, but as for you, speak to the sons of Israel, saying, you shall surely observe my Sabbaths, because this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations. The Sabbath was given also to be a sign of the relationship between God and Israel, that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you, who sets you apart. Now, I know for us, in theological terms, we say, well, listen, we have our salvation, and then we have sanctification, and then we have glorification. And we try to keep sanctification separate from everything else. But really, the idea of sanctification is being set apart. God set the people of Israel apart when he redeemed them from Egypt. He removed them, and they established a covenant there at Sinai where God says, you as a nation are now my people. If you observe this, then these are the good things that will happen. If you fail it, then these are the bad things that will happen. But the idea of that old covenant was we have entered into a relationship based on my having redeemed you out of Egypt. And so the Sabbath, the idea of the Sabbath and Sabbaths was not only to reflect rest, but to reflect redemption. For us to be thinking and remembering the redemptive work of God in setting us free, setting his people free. So when it comes to the feasts and this idea of Sabbaths, let's make this point clear. The biblical feasts instruct us that God has initiated a plan. So look very carefully at chapter 23. It is the Lord's appointed times. It is my appointed times, see? It's not based on just on agricultural and rituals, just like the nations. No, God says, these are my times that I'm setting. God is initiating a plan to meet with his people. Why does I emphasize this meeting with his people? Because there's another term that runs throughout this, and that is that they are holy convocations. What's a convocation? It's a gathering together. It's a meeting together. These were times for the people of Israel to come together to meet with God. That was the purpose weekly of the Sabbath, and that's the purpose of these appointed festivals, was for them to meet with God, remembering his rest, remembering his redemption. And so, biblical feasts instruct us that God has initiated a plan to meet with his people, and he accomplishes rest and redemption through his plan of appointed times and an appointed person. That person is Jesus, the Christ, the Anointed One. They were shadows of the one who was going to come and bring it into realization. So these festivals were to remind the people of Israel on a regular basis of what it means to be redeemed, and to look forward to the idea of rest. Now, I said that you look at the feasts, there are 4 feasts in the spring. Those 4 feasts in the spring foreshadow the redemptive work of Christ that he accomplished. Passover, unleavened bread, Pentecost. See, those things, that's what Christ has done in his first advent in accomplishing redemption. The fall feasts look more to the second advent, where that redemption is perfected and applied. So we look forward to the Feast of Trumpets, his second advent. We look forward to the Tabernacles, because the Feast of Tabernacles is what? We dwell with him. We get to enjoy his presence the perfect way again, the way God originally designed it. And so these feasts, we'll look at them separately, but let's keep the big picture in mind about rest, redemption. Now, having said that, as a point of clarification, let me give two dangers that sometimes arise from looking at these Old Testament passages. A number of years ago, when I first went to Nicaragua, I met a pastor who was part of our training session. His name was Pastor Paulo. Wonderful man. Loved Jesus. And he was so excited. He wanted us to come and see his church and his ministry. So we did. We went to see, and we saw this building, and there was a school there. They had a Christian school. When I say Christian school, do not think CHCA. Do not think Cincinnati Christian School. Don't even think of the school that your kids attend. Okay, that would be an image far beyond what was in that place. But they were so excited. They had a large meeting, it's like an assembly hall, kind of outdoors, covered. And as I walked around, I looked, and there were these huge banners, and they were all about the feasts of Israel. And I thought, well, this is neat, you know? I mean, they're teaching the children, and by the way, that's where the church met on Sundays and other nights of the week. But they were teaching their people about the feasts of Israel, and I thought, this is wonderful. And we were back for another training session, and Paulo says, will you come to my church, and will you guys preach at our church one night? And so we did. We went to church. And as we're there, all of a sudden these guys appear with shofars. You know, the ram's horn? And they start blowing the ram's horn. And the people are standing up and moving and shaking, and there's some other things happening in that room, and suddenly the light went on. It's like, wait a minute, you know what? These banners aren't about them teaching the people about the feasts. What they were doing was, they looked in the Bible, saw the feasts, and said, this is what we have to do. They thought that they had to observe the feasts and act like the people of Israel did with the shofars. And then it was like, okay, this is why we're here, to help them understand how to interpret the Bible. Okay? So just because it's there doesn't mean that's what we do. All right? There's another danger. I call it a danger. What we see in this idea of shadows and substance is something that is called a type. In hermeneutics is nothing but the science of interpretation. And by the way, every time you read something, whether it's a newspaper article, nobody reads a newspaper though, whether you're reading online something, reading a book or whatever, everything you read, you subconsciously are applying and using laws of hermeneutics, in case you wonder. So those same laws, those same ideas, how we come to the Bible. Our hermeneutic here at Faith Bible Church, we say, is a literal, historical, grammatical. We want to pay attention to what it says, the words, how it's put together, its historical context, things like that. But that does not mean that there aren't other genre, other things of special hermeneutics, so-called types. Types are these things that we find in the Old Testament that are shadows of something that is coming later, that is greater, something of substance, something that is realized. And particularly, you see that with reference to Christ. So when you read the book of Hebrews, for example, the writer to the Hebrews talks about types and the fulfillment of those types in Christ. So Melchizedek, for example, was a real person in the Old Testament who is a type of the priesthood of Christ. Christ's priesthood is greater than Melchizedek's. Moses is seen as a type of Christ. The sacrificial systems are types of Christ. So you see these ideas of types and then the realization, shadows and substance. So we recognize the genuineness of that. But there is a danger. In an attempt to honor Christ, sometimes people look at passages in the Old Testament and they say, I've got to find Christ in this passage. In their desire to exalt Christ and glorify Christ, there's a school of thought that says every passage speaks of Christ. So, for example, when Jesus in the road to Emmaus opens the scriptures to the disciples on the road, and he says, look, all the scriptures speak of me, he doesn't mean every passage of the scriptures. That's not what he means. What he means is all the scriptures, that includes the law, the prophets, the writings. You can go to anywhere in the sections of the Old Testament scriptures, and you'll find those prophetic passages that speak of Christ. But it doesn't mean every passage. Because when you start doing that, then you start making everything a type. And when you start making everything a type, now it becomes a matter of subjectivity. And the Bible loses its real meaning. Okay? So we're handling types, but we're trying to handle them in a correct way when it comes to the feasts of Israel. Okay? So, big idea, they point to rest, point to redemption. Holy convocations to meet with God. You start thinking about this and you realize, wait a minute, you're saying that the God who created the heavens and the earth, this God who's beyond our imagination, initiates a desire to meet with me. And the answer to that is yes. God desires to meet with every one of us. But we have a problem, don't we? That's separation. And so what is required of us personally is what? Redemption. If we want rest, and Jesus promised rest, he said, look, if you're tired, if you're weary, if you're given out, come to me, and I'll give you rest. That's an invitation to say, look, I'm going to make you whole. I'm going to restore you because you're broken. You need redemption. Redemption doesn't come by following rituals. Redemption for the people of Israel did not come just because they observed the Sabbath or the feasts or anything else. It doesn't come by religious ritual. It comes by personal understanding and recognition of what God has done and done for you through Jesus Christ. That's redemption. And when you're redeemed, there's rest. And rest is meeting with God, knowing Him. That's an invitation that's open to all of us, personally. It's what every person needs. And He's made provision for it. He has made appointed times and an appointed person. But this idea of holy convocation is not merely for me as an individual or personally. The idea of the holy convocation was for the people to communally, collectively. The people of Israel went together. In fact, there are 3 of these feasts where they were required to go up to Jerusalem. And so they go as pilgrims together. These holy convocations weren't just meeting with God as me as a person. It was the idea of a corporate meeting with God. That what God does in the human experience, it says, builds into our lives a rhythm of life for meeting Him personally and corporately. He did that through Sabbaths, holy convocation, and He does it through feasts. Think about this past year. One of the great difficulties this past year of COVID was what? We couldn't meet together. One of the great difficulties this past year was we couldn't meet together. Where it seems that God says corporate meeting is very important in the rhythm of our spiritual life. Live stream has been a great asset. It really has been a great tool for us this past year, for people to, when they couldn't meet together, could at least say, hey, I can be a part, even if it's virtually, be together. And we still do that. We still are live streaming our services for those who are away, those who can't, and it's providing a wonderful resource. But let me be clear. Live stream virtual church is no replacement for the corporate church community gathering together. When we gather together, James, it's to sing that new song. It's to remember and reflect upon the redemptive work that Christ has done and to meet with Him as redeemed people. That's what we're here for today. The holy convocations, the festivals, provided that rhythm of corporateness for the people of Israel. So over the next weeks, we'll spend some time working through Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits. And we'll want to see Jesus, and we'll want to see what Jesus has done for us in accomplishing redemption and rest for us and for the people of God. As I said, coming to church, attending church, that's religious ritual. Whatever that ritual is for you, that's not what gives you rest. It is an absolute confidence and belief that Jesus is the one that God has appointed to be the Redeemer for you, to redeem you, that you might have that meeting with God and rest.